How do you explain to someone who has never stood inside a nuclear reactor control room what it feels like to watch your entire future evaporate in 2.4 seconds? How do you make someone understand what it means to taste metal on your tongue and know, deep in your bones, that you are already dead, even though you are still standing, still breathing, still able to see your reflection in the broken glass scattered across the floor? My name is Vasily Ivanovich Kodemchuk. I am 70 years old. I live alone in a small apartment in Kiev, Ukraine. 40 years ago, I was 30 years old, married to the most beautiful woman in Pripyat, father of 2 healthy children, and I had what every Soviet man dreamed of having: a good job, a new apartment, respect from my neighbors, and a future that seemed as solid as the concrete beneath the reactor I operated every single night. On April 26, 1986, at exactly 1:23 in the morning, all of that disappeared in a blinding flash of light and a sound that still wakes me up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I am 30 years old again, and running through those dark corridors trying to understand why the ceiling is gone and why I can see stars through a hole that should not exist. Before I continue telling you what happened that night, what really happened, not what the Soviet government told the world, not what the sanitized documentaries show you, but what I saw with my own eyes, what I smelled, what I tasted, what I felt burning through my skin, I want to ask you something. Subscribe to this channel. Just click that red button down there, because what I am about to reveal here has never been said in any official documentary, in any government-approved book, in any museum exhibition. Only those of us who were there, only those of us who saw it with our own eyes, who felt the heat from the exposed reactor core on our faces, who carried our dying friends out of that building, can tell this truth. And I was there. I was in the control room. Come back with me now. I need to show you something I have kept in the drawer of my nightstand for 40 years. It is a photograph. Just a simple photograph, the kind every Soviet family had, black and white, slightly faded now, the edges worn from being handled too many times by fingers that shake. It shows me and my wife Oksana on our wedding day in 1978. I am 22 years old in that picture, wearing a suit I borrowed from my older brother, grinning like I just won the lottery. Oksana is 21, wearing a white dress her mother sewed by hand, holding a bouquet of wildflowers we picked that morning because we could not afford roses. We are standing in front of the Palace of Culture in Pripyat, the city that would become our home, the city that would become a ghost town, the city where our children would take their first steps and speak their first words, the city we would be forced to abandon forever, exactly 8 years later. I keep this photograph not because I want to remember that day, though it was the happiest day of my life up until that point. I keep it because it is the only photograph I have where Oksana is looking at me the way she used to look at me before Chernobyl, before the radiation, before the hospitals, before the miscarriages, before the anger and the fear and the slow, agonizing realization that our marriage could not survive what that reactor did to us. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the world before, to a time when Chernobyl was not a word that made people think of death and disaster, but simply the name of the power plant where I worked, where I was proud to work, where I thought I would work until I retired at 60 and collected my pension and watched my grandchildren grow up in the same apartment complex where I raised my own children. Pripyat was not like other Soviet cities. Americans, when I tell you about Pripyat, I need you to understand something. Imagine a brand new suburb in California in the 1960s. Imagine planned communities with parks and playgrounds, new apartment buildings with elevators that actually worked, stores that actually had food on the shelves, a cinema that showed films only 2 months after they premiered in Moscow, an indoor swimming pool, an amusement park that was scheduled to open on May 1st for the May Day celebration. Imagine a place where young families wanted to live, where engineers and scientists and skilled workers were moving because it represented the future, the bright Soviet future we were all building together. That was Pripyat. The average age of residents was 26 years old. 26. It was a city of young people, of new parents pushing strollers, of children learning to ride bicycles, of couples getting married and moving into their first apartments and planting flowers on their balconies and believing, truly believing, that life would keep getting better. My wife Oksana and I moved to Pripyat in 1979, 1 year after we got married. I had just completed my training as a reactor operator. To be selected for a position at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was like being hired by NASA in America. It was prestigious. It paid well. It came with an apartment allocation, which in the Soviet Union was worth more than gold, because most people waited 10, 15, 20 years for their own apartment. We waited 6 months. 6 months after I started working at the plant, we got a 2-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor of a building on Lenina Avenue. 2 bedrooms. You have to understand what that meant. My parents raised 5 children in a 1-bedroom apartment in a village 200 kilometers away. Oksana grew up sharing a room with 3 sisters. 2 bedrooms meant we could have children, plural, and they would each have their own space. It meant we had arrived. We had made it. The Soviet dream was real, and we were living it. Our son Dmitry was born in 1980. Our daughter Natasha was born in 1983. I have a memory, crystal clear, sharp as broken glass, of coming home from my night shift at the plant on a morning in March of 1986, just 5 weeks before the accident. It was a Saturday morning. The sun was coming up. The air was cold, but you could smell spring arriving. That particular smell of snow melting and earth thawing and life returning after the long winter. I climbed the stairs to our apartment, 8 floors because the elevator was broken again, and I opened the door and I heard laughter. Children laughing. Oksana was making breakfast, blinis with sour cream, and Dmitry, who was 6 years old, was chasing Natasha, who was 3, around the kitchen table, both of them shrieking with joy about something only children find hilarious. Oksana looked up at me and smiled, flour on her cheek, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she said, "Coffee is ready. Sit down before it gets cold." That memory is the last purely happy memory I have. Everything after that is contaminated, poisoned, infected by what came later. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of our apartment, watching my wife cook breakfast and my children play, I thought, this is it. This is what I worked for. This is what life is supposed to be. 5 weeks later, I would be standing in a hospital corridor in Moscow, watching my best friend die slowly, his skin falling off in strips, and I would be thinking, how did we get here? How did this happen? But again, I am jumping ahead. Let me tell you about the work, about what it was like to be a senior control room operator at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Americans, let me translate this for you. Working at Chernobyl was like being an engineer at a nuclear submarine base or a technician at a top-secret military facility. It was serious work, important work. We wore white coats and hard hats. We carried dosimeters that measured radiation exposure. We went through security checkpoints. We had Communist Party meetings where they reminded us that we were building the future of the Soviet Union, that nuclear power would free us from dependence on coal and oil, that the RBMK reactor was the most advanced reactor design in the world, safer than the American pressurized water reactors, more efficient, more powerful. We believed them. Why would not we? These were scientists, engineers, experts from Moscow. They had designed the reactor, they had built it. They told us it was safe, and we believed them because we had no reason not to believe them. My specific job was to monitor the cooling system for reactor number 4. Every night I sat at my station in the control room, watching gauges and dials and lights, making sure water was flowing through the system at the correct pressure and temperature, making sure the reactor was not overheating, making sure everything was operating within normal parameters. It was routine work, mostly. Boring, even. 12-hour shifts, midnight to noon, 4 days on, 3 days off. The night shift was quieter than the day shift. Fewer managers walking around, fewer inspections, fewer interruptions. It was just us, the operators, and the machines. We had a routine. At midnight, when the shift started, we would gather in the break room for tea. Real tea, not the terrible substitute tea most Soviet citizens drank, but actual imported tea from Georgia, because the plant administration made sure we had good food and good tea, and even real coffee sometimes. We would drink tea and eat sandwiches that our wives packed for us, and we would talk about normal things: football, upcoming holidays, whose turn it was to organize the Saturday workday where we all volunteered to clean up the grounds around the plant. At 12:30, we would take our positions in the control room. Alexander Akimov, who was 33 years old and had been my supervisor for 2 years, would assign tasks for the shift. Vasily, monitor cooling system. Boris, watch the turbine pressure. Leonid, you are on reactor control tonight. Leonid Toptonov was 25 years old, fresh out of training, nervous and eager, and always asking questions. Alexander liked him because he was careful, methodical, the kind of operator who double-checked everything. Alexander Akimov was the best supervisor I ever worked for. He was calm under pressure. He trusted his team. He covered for us when we made small mistakes, and in return, we worked hard for him. We did not cut corners. We took pride in keeping our reactor running smoothly, shift after shift after shift. He had a pregnant wife at home. His third child, a boy, was supposed to be born in July. That boy never met his father. By the time he was born, Alexander was already dead, buried in a sealed zinc coffin in a special cemetery outside Moscow, his body so radioactive that the coffin had to be encased in concrete. But I did not know that on the night of April 25th, 1986, when I showed up for my shift at 11:45, 15 minutes early like I always was, carrying a thermos of tea that Oksana had prepared, wearing the same white coat I had worn for 3 years, walking through the same security checkpoint I walked through 4 times a week, nodding to the same guards who knew my face and my name and waved me through without checking my identification. It was a normal night, a routine night. There was nothing in the air, no sense of foreboding, no ominous feeling that something terrible was about to happen. If anything,
The mood in the control room that night was slightly tense because we had been told that we were going to conduct a safety test during our shift. A safety test. Let me explain what that means. The RBMK reactor had a backup cooling system that was supposed to kick in automatically if the main power supply failed.
But there was a gap, a 40-second gap between when the main power failed and when the backup diesel generators started up. 40 seconds during which the reactor would have no cooling. 40 seconds during which, theoretically, the reactor could start to overheat. The safety test was designed to see if the turbines could generate enough residual electricity during those 40 seconds to power the cooling pumps and bridge the gap until the diesel generators came online. It was a reasonable test, a necessary test. Except the test had been postponed multiple times over the previous day because of grid demand, and now it was after midnight, and our shift was being ordered to conduct the test, even though we had not been part of the planning, even though we did not have the full procedure written down, even though Alexander kept asking, "Are you sure we should do this now?" And the deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, kept saying, "Yes, do it, now. We cannot postpone again." Moscow is waiting for the results. Anatoly Dyatlov was 55 years old. He had worked in the Soviet nuclear industry for 30 years. He was brilliant, arrogant, impatient, and absolutely convinced that he knew better than everyone else. When Alexander expressed concerns about conducting the test with the reactor in a low-power state, Dyatlov snapped, "I have more experience than all of you combined. Follow the procedure. Start the test." We followed the procedure. That is what Soviet workers did. You followed orders. You did not question your superiors. You did your job. At approximately 12:30 in the morning on April 26th, we began the test. We started reducing the reactor power, slowly bringing it down from its normal operating level of 3,200 megawatts thermal to the test level of 700 to 1,000 megawatts. Everything seemed normal at first. The power decreased steadily. The control rods were inserted gradually. The cooling water continued to flow. But then, at around 12:28 in the morning, something went wrong. The reactor power dropped suddenly, drastically, falling to 30 megawatts thermal instead of the target 700. 30 megawatts. That is 1% of normal operating power. The reactor was barely producing any energy at all. Leonid Toptanov, who was controlling the reactor, looked panicked. "I do not understand what happened. I followed the procedure exactly." Alexander immediately said, "We need to abort the test. Bring the reactor back up to normal power, slowly." But Dyatlov was standing behind us, leaning over Leonid's shoulder, and he said, "No, we have already started. We continue. Bring the power back up. We will run the test at 200 megawatts." Alexander said, "That is too low. The reactor is not stable at that power level." Dyatlov said, "I am the deputy chief engineer. I am telling you to continue. That is an order." Here is what we did not know, what they did not tell us, what the reactor designers in Moscow conveniently failed to mention in our training. The RBMK reactor has what engineers call a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, it means that when the reactor is operating at very low power and you start removing water from the cooling system, which we were doing as part of the test, the reactor becomes unstable. It becomes unpredictable. It can experience a sudden, uncontrollable power surge. We did not know this. Dyatlov knew this, or should have known this. but he did not tell us. At 1:20 in the morning, we began the actual test. We shut off the emergency cooling system, as the procedure required, so that it would not interfere with the test. We increased the water flow through the cooling system to compensate for the reduced power. We started withdrawing control rods to bring the power back up to 200 megawatts. And the reactor responded, sort of. The power started climbing. 200 megawatts, 250, 300. The gauges were showing increasing power, but they were also showing something else, something wrong. The reactivity was increasing too fast. The coolant temperature was rising. Alarms started beeping. Not screaming, not emergency alarms, just warning beeps that indicated the reactor was approaching the edge of its safe operating limits. Alexander said, "I do not like this. The reactivity margin is too low." The reactivity margin is a measure of how many control rods are available to shut down the reactor in an emergency. Our reactivity margin that night was around 15 rods. The safety minimum was 30 rods. We were operating with half the safety margin we should have had. Dyatlov said, "It is fine. Continue." At 1:23 in the morning, we pressed the button to start the turbine coast down, the actual moment of the test. The turbine started slowing down. The power output from the turbine started dropping. The cooling pumps, which were powered by the turbine, started slowing down. Less cooling water was flowing through the reactor. And that is when everything went to hell. The reactor power started rising, not slowly, not gradually, exponentially. In seconds, it went from 200 megawatts to 1,500 megawatts, then 3,000, then 6,000. The gauges were maxing out. The alarms were screaming now, every single alarm in the control room going off at once, lights flashing red everywhere, and Alexander was shouting, "Shut it down! Emergency shutdown! Press AZ5!" AZ5 was the emergency shutdown button. Press it, and all the control rods would drop into the reactor core simultaneously, absorbing neutrons, stopping the nuclear reaction, shutting down the reactor. Leonid pressed the button. I saw him press it. I was standing 3 meters away, and I saw his hand slam down on that red button at exactly 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning. The control rods started descending. I could hear the mechanical sound of them moving, a grinding, whirring sound that every operator recognized. But they did not descend all the way. Here is what we did not know, what the designers did not tell us, the fatal flaw in the RBMK reactor design. The control rods had graphite tips. When you insert a control rod into an RBMK reactor that is already unstable, that is already experiencing a power surge, the graphite tip actually increases reactivity for a brief moment before the neutron-absorbing part of the rod takes effect. It is called the positive scram effect. Scram means emergency shutdown. Positive means it makes things worse before it makes them better. For about 2 to 3 seconds after Leonid pressed that button, instead of shutting down the reactor, we made it worse. The power surged to 30,000 megawatts thermal, 10 times the maximum rated power, 10 times more energy than the reactor was designed to handle. And then the fuel rods exploded. Not a nuclear explosion, not like an atomic bomb, but a steam explosion. The water in the cooling channels flashing instantly to steam with such force that it blew apart the fuel assemblies, ruptured the pressure tubes, shattered the reactor core. I heard the sound first,
A deep bass rumble, like thunder underground, followed immediately by a sharp crack, like 1,000 windows breaking at once. The floor beneath my feet lurched. I stumbled, grabbed the edge of my control panel to keep from falling. The lights in the control room flickered, half of them went out. Emergency lighting came on, dim red lights that made everything look like a nightmare. Dust and debris started falling from the ceiling.
Someone was shouting. I do not remember who. Maybe Alexander, maybe Boris. Words I could not make out over the sound of alarms and hissing steam and something else. A roaring sound, like wind, like fire. And then the second explosion, bigger than the first, louder. The entire building shook. I was thrown against the wall. My head hit something hard. For a moment, everything went white, then black. Then I was on the floor, ears ringing, vision blurry, tasting blood in my mouth and something else. Something metallic, bitter, wrong. I tried to stand up. My legs would not work properly. I looked around the control room. The windows on the far wall, the windows that overlooked the reactor hall, were gone. Just gone. Blown out. Through the empty window frames I could see flames, blue flames, bright electric blue, brighter than anything I had ever seen, reaching up into the night sky where the roof of the reactor building used to be. The roof was gone too. I could see stars. I could see the moon. I could see smoke and dust and pieces of burning debris floating through the air like snow. And I could see the reactor core, the exposed reactor core. The heart of the reactor, 1,194 fuel channels filled with uranium, graphite moderator blocks glowing white hot, exposed to the open air. Burning, releasing radiation into the atmosphere, releasing more radiation in 1 second than my dosimeter could measure in an entire year. Alexander was trying to stand up. Blood was running down the side of his face from a cut above his eye. Follow the chain of command. So instead of running, instead of doing what every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do, which was to get as far away from that building as humanly possible, I stood up, wiped the blood from my mouth, and I helped Alexander check on the other operators. Boris Stolyarchuk was conscious, shaken but unhurt. Leonid Toptonov was sitting at his station, staring at his control panel like he could not comprehend what he was seeing. All the gauges dead, all the lights off, everything indicating complete system failure. Alexander grabbed him by the shoulder and said, "Leonid, are you hurt?" Leonid looked up at him with eyes that were completely empty, completely lost, and said, "I pressed the button. I pressed AZ5 exactly like I was supposed to. Why did it explode? What did I do wrong?" Alexander said, "You did nothing wrong. This was not your fault. Because if he was wrong, if the reactor really was exposed, if that really was the core burning in front of us, then we were all dead men. We just did not know it yet." Alexander said, "Yes, Comrade Dyatlov. What are your orders?" Dyatlov said, "Send men to inspect the reactor hall. Manually open the cooling water valves. We need to flood the reactor space." "Stolyarchuk, you go. Take 2 men with you." Boris looked at Alexander. Alexander looked at me. I looked at the empty windows, at the blue flames still reaching into the sky, and I thought, if I go into that reactor hall, I am going to die. But I did not say that out loud. Instead, I said, "I will go with Boris." "Now I want you to tell me something.
I want to know where you are watching this from. Comment down below. Write it like this: Brazil, Portugal, Mexico, Argentina, Spain, wherever you are. I want to know how far this truth is reaching. How many people in how many countries are finally learning what really happened to us? Go ahead. Comment now. It takes only 2 seconds. Now let me take you back to those terrible moments. The three of us, Boris, myself, and a young technician named Viktor Proskuryakov, who was only 24 years old and engaged to be married in June, walked out of the control room and into the corridor. Immediately, the air changed.
In the control room, even with the dust and the broken windows, the air had felt relatively normal. In the corridor, the air felt thick, heavy, wrong. I could taste it on my tongue, that metallic taste, sharp and bitter, like licking a battery. My teeth hurt, my gums hurt, my skin felt hot, flushed, like I had been standing in direct sunlight for too long. Except we were inside a building in the middle of the night. We walked down the corridor toward the stairwell that led up to the reactor hall. Emergency lighting flickered. Water was leaking from somewhere, dripping down the walls, pooling on the floor. Steam was hissing from broken pipes. And scattered across the floor, glowing faintly in the dim light, were chunks of something black and gray. Graphite. Pieces of graphite moderator blocks from inside the reactor core, blown out by the explosion, scattered through the building like deadly confetti. Boris saw them and said, "Do not step on those. Go around them." We went around them. We climbed the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last. My legs felt weak. My heart was pounding. At the top of the stairs, there was a door that led into the reactor hall. Boris opened that door. The heat that came through that doorway was like opening an oven. No, not an oven. Like standing in front of a blast furnace. I could feel my face burning. The air shimmered. And beyond that door, I could see it. The reactor. Or what was left of it. The massive concrete and steel structure that had housed the reactor core was split open like a cracked egg. The biological shield, a disk of steel and concrete that weighed 2,000 tons, was tilted at an angle, partially collapsed into the reactor space below. The fuel channels, those 1,194 vertical tubes that contained the uranium fuel, were destroyed. Many of them were blown apart, their contents scattered, and in the center of all that destruction, in the heart of what used to be a carefully controlled nuclear reaction, graphite was burning. Graphite blocks, each one the size of a concrete cinder block, stacked around the fuel channels, designed to moderate the nuclear reaction, were now on fire, burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, glowing white and blue and purple, colors that should not exist outside of science fiction, releasing radiation that my dosimeter could not measure, because the dosimeter only went up to 3.6 Röntgen per hour, and the actual radiation levels in that room were 15,000 Röntgen per hour. 15,000. Let me put that in perspective for you. A chest X-ray exposes you to 0.1 Röntgen. A full-body CT scan exposes you to about 1 Röntgen. Working in a nuclear power plant under normal conditions, you might receive 5 Röntgen over an entire year. Standing in that doorway, looking at that exposed reactor core, I received more radiation in 5 seconds than I should have received in my entire lifetime. And I stood there for almost 40 seconds before Boris grabbed my arm and pulled me back and slammed the door shut. Viktor Proskoryakoff, the young technician who was supposed to get married in June, said, "We need to open the cooling valves. That is what Dyatlov ordered." Boris said, "We cannot go in there. We will die in minutes." Viktor said, "We have to try. We have to do something." So we tried. We found a manual valve wheel in a corridor adjacent to the reactor hall. We turned that wheel, forcing it open against pressure that should not have existed because the cooling system was supposed to be depressurized. Water started flowing. We could hear it rushing through pipes, but we had no way of knowing if it was reaching the reactor, if it was doing any good, if it was putting out the fire, or just evaporating instantly into radioactive steam. We returned to the control room. Dyatlov was still there, still insisting the reactor was intact, still giving orders like the situation was under control. Alexander reported what we had seen. He said, "The reactor core is exposed and burning. The radiation levels are lethal. We cannot send any more men into that area." Dyatlov said, "You are mistaken. What you saw was burning hydrogen. The reactor is intact." Alexander said, with more courage than I have ever seen anyone display before or since, "Comrade Dyatlov, I'm telling you as a senior operator with 10 years of experience, the reactor is destroyed. We need to evacuate the building and call Moscow immediately." Dyatlov stared at him for a long moment, and I could see the realization beginning to form in his eyes. The understanding that he had just presided over the worst nuclear accident in human history, that his decisions had killed his subordinates, that his career was over, that he might be executed for this. But instead of admitting it, instead of accepting responsibility, he said, "Fine. Call Moscow. Tell them we have a situation, but the reactor is intact. That is what you will tell them. The reactor is intact." Alexander did not argue. He went to the telephone in the control room office, and he called the plant director, Viktor Brukhanov, and woke him up at 2 in the morning and told him there had been an accident. I was standing close enough to hear the conversation. Brukhanov said, "How bad is it?" Alexander said, "The reactor is destroyed. The core is exposed. We have casualties." Brukhanov said, "That is impossible. Reactors do not explode. You are panicking. Assess the situation properly and call me back." He hung up. Alexander called Moscow next. He got through to someone at the Ministry of Energy, I do not know who, some bureaucrat whose name I never learned, and he said, "This is Alexander Akimov, shift supervisor at Chernobyl nuclear power plant. We have had an accident. There has been an explosion. The reactor is destroyed." The voice on the other end of the line said, "Repeat that. Did you say the reactor is destroyed?" Alexander said, "Yes." There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Stand by for instructions. Do not leave your post. Keep the remaining systems operational. Do not evacuate. Do not cause panic. We are sending specialists. They will arrive by morning." The line went dead. We stood there in the control room, surrounded by broken equipment and flickering lights and alarms that would not stop screaming, and we waited. That is what Soviet workers did. We waited for instructions from Moscow. While we waited, men were dying. The first casualties were not the operators in the control room. We received massive doses of radiation, yes, but not immediately fatal doses. The first men to die were the ones who ran toward the fire without knowing what they were running toward. Firefighters from the Pripyat fire station arrived within minutes of the first explosion. They were told there was a fire on the roof of the reactor building. They were not told about the radiation.
They climbed onto that roof, onto the remains of the building directly above the exposed reactor core, and they fought that fire for hours. They used water hoses. They climbed ladders. They walked across rooftops covered in graphite debris that was emitting 50,000 Röntgen per hour. They did not know. Nobody told them. Their dosimeters were reading 3.6 Röntgen, the maximum the dosimeters could measure, and their commanders were telling them, 3.6 is not great, but not terrible. Keep working.
3.6 was not the real number. The real number was 50,000. The firefighters were receiving lethal doses every minute they stayed on that roof, and they stayed for hours because they were brave, and they were told the fire needed to be put out, and nobody told them they were sacrificing their lives for nothing, because you cannot put out a graphite fire with water, and even if you could, the radiation would kill them long before the fire did. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, commander of the 1st Firefighting Unit to arrive, spent 4 hours on that roof. He was 23 years old. He died 14 days later in a hospital in Moscow, his organs failing one by one, his skin falling off, his body destroyed from the inside out by radiation poisoning. Sergeant Viktor Kibanuk, who led a team onto the roof of the turbine hall, stayed up there until dawn, until the fire was finally extinguished, breathing radioactive smoke, handling graphite chunks with his bare hands because his gloves melted from the heat. He was 25 years old. He died in Moscow 14 days after the accident, blind and paralyzed. His wife not allowed to visit him because he was too contaminated. These men were heroes. They saved lives. If they had not put out those fires, if the flames had spread to reactors 1, 2, and 3, if those reactors had also exploded, the catastrophe would have been 10 times worse. But they did not know they were heroes. They thought they were just doing their jobs. They thought they would go home to their families at the end of their shifts. Nobody told them the truth. Nobody told them they were already dead. Inside the plant, operators like Valery Perevolchenko, the shift foreman of Reactor 4, were trying to rescue workers trapped in the wreckage. Valery led teams into areas with radiation levels that were off the scale, searching for 2 pump operators who had been working in the reactor hall when the explosion occurred. Those 2 men, Valery Kodemchuk and Viktor Kuranov, were never found. Their bodies are still there, somewhere in the wreckage, entombed when they built the sarcophagus over the reactor. Valery himself survived the initial rescue attempts. He walked away from the plant that morning, having received a massive dose of radiation, and he reported to the hospital in Pripyat. Within hours, he was vomiting blood. Within days, his skin was peeling off in sheets. He died 21 days after the accident, in agony, his body rejecting bone marrow transplants, his immune system destroyed, infections spreading through his organs faster than antibiotics could fight them. All of this was happening while we sat in a control room, waiting for instructions from Moscow. At around 4 in the morning, the sun still not yet risen, Alexander told me and Boris and the others, "Go home, get some sleep, come back for the evening shift." I said, "Should we not stay? Help with the emergency response?" Alexander said, "There is nothing more we can do right now. The fire brigades are here. The specialists from Moscow are coming. Go home. Spend time with your families. Tell them you are okay." So I went home. I walked out of the plant, through the security checkpoint where the guards were still checking identification cards like it was a normal night, past the parking lot where our cars were covered in a fine gray dust that I now know was radioactive fallout, and I drove back to Pripyat. The sun was coming up as I drove. The streets were empty. The city was quiet. I parked outside my apartment building on Lenina Avenue, and I climbed the 8 flights of stairs, and I opened the door to my apartment. And Oksana was in the kitchen, making breakfast, and Dmitri and Natasha were still asleep in their room. Oksana looked at me and said, "You are home early. Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to say, "No, everything is not okay. The reactor exploded. I was exposed to lethal radiation. We need to leave right now." But I did not say that. Because I had been trained not to cause panic. Because I had been ordered not to spread information without authorization. Because I still, even after everything I had seen, believed that the authorities would handle it, that Moscow would send help, that everything would be okay. So I said, "There was an accident at the plant. A fire. They sent us home while they deal with it. I am fine." Oksana said, "You look pale. You should rest." I said, "I will rest, but first I am going to take a shower." I took the longest shower of my life. I scrubbed my skin until it was red and raw. I washed my hair 3 times. I stood under the hot water and I tried to wash away the radiation that I could not see, could not feel, could not smell, but that I knew was there, inside my body, in my lungs, in my blood, in my bones, killing me cell by cell. When I got out of the shower, I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked normal, a little tired, a little pale, but normal. I thought, maybe it is not as bad as I think. Maybe Dyatlov is right. Maybe the reactor is intact and what I saw was just hydrogen burning. I went to bed. I lay down next to my wife and I tried to sleep. But I could not sleep. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blue flames. I saw the exposed reactor core. I saw graphite glowing white hot. I tasted metal in my mouth. I felt heat on my face. I heard the explosion over and over and over. At around 10 in the morning, Oksana woke me up. She said, "Vasily, the phone is ringing. It is the plant. They want you to come back." I went back. Of course I went back. That is what Soviet workers did. We followed orders. When I arrived at the plant, the situation had gotten worse, much worse. The fire was mostly out, but the reactor was still burning. Graphite was still smoldering. Radiation was still pouring into the atmosphere. And now, in the daylight, we could see the full extent of the damage. The roof of the reactor building was completely destroyed. The walls were cracked. Debris was scattered across hundreds of meters. And in the sky above the plant, there was a column of smoke rising straight up, a pillar of radioactive particles being carried by the wind across Ukraine, across Belarus, across Europe. People in Pripyat were waking up and going about their normal Saturday routines. Children were playing in parks. Families were shopping for groceries. Couples were walking along the river. Nobody told them that invisible particles were falling from the sky, settling on their skin, in their hair, on the playgrounds where their children played, in the soil where the vegetables grew, in the water they drank. Nobody told them because the authorities had not yet decided what to tell them. Moscow was still discussing the situation. The Communist Party was still determining the official narrative. And while they discussed and determined and crafted their response, ordinary people in Pripyat were being irradiated. At the plant, we were trying to stabilize what was left of the reactor systems.
We were pumping water into the reactor space, trying to cool the burning graphite. We were monitoring radiation levels with dosimeters that were completely inadequate for measuring what we were actually dealing with. We were following orders from people who did not understand what had happened and were not willing to admit the magnitude of the disaster.
Dyatlov was in the plant director's office, arguing with Brukhanov, insisting the reactor was intact, insisting the radiation readings were wrong, insisting this was a containable accident. Brukhanov was calling Moscow every hour, asking for guidance, for equipment, for specialists, for someone to tell him what to do. Moscow was sending delegations, commissions, experts who would arrive, inspect the situation, hold meetings, file reports, and do absolutely nothing useful. Meanwhile, we were dying. Not dramatically, not all at once, not falling down dead in the control room like you see in movies. No, we were dying slowly, internally, invisibly. The radiation was destroying our bone marrow, the tissue inside our bones that produces blood cells. Without bone marrow, your body cannot make new white blood cells to fight infections. It cannot make new red blood cells to carry oxygen. It cannot make platelets to clot your blood. You become anemic. You become immunocompromised. You bruise easily. You bleed from your gums, your nose, your intestines. Infections that a healthy person would fight off easily become life-threatening. By the afternoon of April 26th, less than 12 hours after the explosion, some of us were already showing symptoms: nausea, vomiting, headaches, dizziness, fatigue. We thought it was stress. We thought it was exhaustion. We thought we just needed rest. At around 6 in the evening, someone finally made the decision to measure radiation levels properly. Not with the little dosimeters that maxed out at 3.6 Röntgen, but with military-grade equipment that could measure thousands of Röntgen. They brought in a device from Kiev. They pointed it at the reactor. The reading was 15,000 Röntgen per hour. 15,000. The room went silent. Someone said, "That cannot be right. Check it again." They checked it again. 15,000 Röntgen per hour. Someone else said, "What is the lethal dose?" The answer is 400 Röntgen total, received over a short period of time. 400 Röntgen will kill you. At the exposed reactor core, you could receive 400 Röntgen in less than 2 minutes. The firefighters who spent 4 hours on the roof received doses of 1,600 to 20,000 Röntgen. The operators who went into the reactor hall received doses of 800 to 1,500 Röntgen. I received approximately 550 Röntgen during my various trips through contaminated areas that night and morning. 550 Röntgen. 150 Röntgen more than the lethal dose. But I did not know that yet. Nobody told us. At 8 in the evening on April 26th, 36 hours after the explosion, Pripyat was finally evacuated. 36 hours. For 36 hours, 50,000 people went about their normal lives while radioactive particles rained down on them. When the evacuation order finally came, it was announced over loudspeakers throughout the city. Attention, residents of Pripyat. Due to an accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, radioactive conditions in the city are unfavorable. The Communist Party, government officials, and the military are taking necessary steps to combat this. Nevertheless, in order to ensure complete safety for citizens, and especially for children, it is necessary to temporarily evacuate all residents to nearby towns. For this purpose, buses will be provided to each apartment building today April 27th, beginning at 1400 hours. Residents are advised to take documents, essential items, and food for 3 days. Executives of enterprises and institutions have organized the work of employees who will remain in the city. All housing will be guarded by police during the evacuation period. Comrades, temporarily leaving your residences, do not forget to close windows, turn off electrical and gas appliances, and shut off water taps. We ask you to maintain order and avoid panic and unnecessary excitement during this temporary evacuation. 3 days. They told people they were leaving for 3 days. They told them to pack light, bring only essentials. Do not worry about your apartments. You will be back in 3 days. 40 years later, nobody has been back. The city is still abandoned. The apartments are still there, windows broken, walls crumbling, trees growing through the roofs. Personal belongings scattered across floors, photographs on walls, toys in bedrooms, dishes in sinks. Everything left exactly as it was on April 27, 1986, when 50,000 people walked out of their homes and never returned. I watched them evacuate. I stood on the street outside my apartment building, and I watched 1,200 buses roll into Pripyat. Watched 50,000 people climb aboard with their hastily packed bags and confused children and frightened pets. Watched the buses drive away in a long convoy that stretched for kilometers, leaving behind a city that looked completely normal from the outside, but was fundamentally poisoned, contaminated, destroyed. Oksana was in one of those buses with Dmitri and Natasha. I told her I had to stay at the plant, told her I would join them in a few days, told her not to worry. Everything would be fine. I lied to her face. I knew it was not fine. I knew by then that I had received a lethal dose of radiation. I could feel it in my body. The nausea was constant. My skin felt like it was burning from the inside. My gums were bleeding. But I did not tell her, because what good would it do? What could she do except worry? So I lied, and I watched her bus disappear down the road toward Kiev, and I thought, that is the last time I will see my wife and children as a healthy man. I was right. 3 days after the evacuation, I collapsed at the plant. They took me to Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, the specialized facility for radiation casualties, the place where all the operators and firefighters who had been exposed were being treated, the place where most of us would die. The hospital was chaos, begging the doctors to let him die, begging them to end the pain. But they kept him alive as long as they could, because he was a case study, a data point, a source of information about what radiation does to the human body. Anatoly Dyatlov survived. He received a massive dose of radiation, around 400 Röntgen, right at the threshold of lethality. But he survived the acute phase. He was put on trial in 1987, found guilty of safety violations, sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. He served 3 years before being released early due to deteriorating health. He died in 1995 of heart failure, a common consequence of radiation exposure. Before he died, he wrote a book insisting he was not to blame, insisting the reactor design was flawed, insisting he was a scapegoat. He was right about the reactor design. He was wrong about his own culpability. Both things can be true. I spent 6 weeks in that hospital. 6 weeks of blood transfusions and antibiotics and pain medication and watching my body slowly destroy itself. My hair fell out in clumps. My skin peeled off in sheets. I lost 30 kilograms. I looked like a skeleton. The doctors told my wife, who had been allowed to visit after the first week, "Prepare yourself. He might not survive." But I did survive. My bone marrow somehow started producing blood cells again. My immune system somehow started functioning. My body somehow decided it wanted to live. By July of 1986, I was stable enough to be discharged. They sent me to a sanatorium for radiation victims, a facility where we could recover away from the public, away from people who might ask questions, away from journalists who were trying to find out what really happened. I spent 3 months there, learning to walk again, learning to eat solid food again, learning to look at myself in the mirror without flinching at the stranger staring back at me. In October of 1986, I was allowed to go home. Not to Pripyat, obviously. Pripyat no longer existed as a functioning city. They sent me to Kiev, to a small apartment allocated for evacuees, where Oksana and the children had been living since the evacuation. I walked through the door of that apartment, and my children did not recognize me. Dmitri, who was 6 years old, looked at me and said, "Mama, who is that man?" Natasha, who was 3, hid behind her mother and cried. I had been gone for 6 months. I had left as a healthy man weighing 85 kilograms with a full head of hair, and I returned as a gaunt, bald, scarred stranger weighing 55 kilograms, who could barely climb a flight of stairs without getting winded. Oksana tried. She really tried. She welcomed me home. She cooked my favorite meals. She helped me regain my strength. She told the children, "That is your father. He was sick, but now he is getting better." But things were never the same between us. How could they be? I was not the same person. The radiation had changed me, physically, mentally, emotionally. I had nightmares every night. I would wake up screaming, seeing blue flames, hearing explosions, tasting metal. I could not talk about what happened. Not to her, not to anyone. I had signed documents promising I would not discuss the accident. The KGB had visited me in the hospital and made it very clear that if I spoke to journalists, if I spoke to foreign press, if I said anything that contradicted the official narrative, there would be consequences. So I carried it alone. All of it. The guilt, the trauma, the knowledge that I had been part of something that killed thousands of people and contaminated half of Europe and destroyed an entire city. And Oksana, who had done nothing wrong, who was just a wife and mother trying to keep her family together, had to watch her husband disappear inside himself, had to deal with a man who was physically present but emotionally absent, who could not hold his children without thinking about radiation, who could not sleep without medication, who jumped at sudden noises and avoided crowds, and refused to talk about the most significant event of his life. We tried to have another child in 1987. She miscarried at 3 months. The doctors said it was probably unrelated to my radiation exposure, but we both knew better. We tried again in 1988. She miscarried at 2 months. After that, we stopped trying. The radiation had taken that from us, too. By 1990, our marriage was essentially over. We lived in the same apartment, raised our children together, maintained the appearance of a normal family. But the intimacy was gone. The connection was broken. The love had been slowly poisoned by trauma and guilt and fear. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when Ukraine became independent, when all the secret documents started being released, when journalists could finally report the truth about Chernobyl, Oksana read newspaper articles that contradicted everything I had told her, that revealed the extent of the lies, the cover-ups, the deliberate misinformation. She came to me with a newspaper in her hand and said, "Is this true? Were you lying to me all these years?" I said, "I was not lying. I was following orders. I was protecting you." She said, "Protecting me? By keeping me in the dark? By letting me and the children stay in Pripyat for 36 hours while radiation fell from the sky? By not telling me you were dying?" I had no answer to that. What could I say? She was right. In 1993, we divorced. She remarried in 1995 to a man who was not broken, who could sleep through the night, who could hold his family without fear. I do not blame her. I never blamed her. Dmitry is 46 years old now. He lives in Canada. He moved there in 2003, as far away from Chernobyl as he could get. We talk maybe twice a year. He is polite but distant. He has his own family, 2 children I have never met except through photographs he emails me occasionally. He does not like to talk about Chernobyl. He does not like to think about growing up as the son of a liquidator, about being pointed at in school, about other parents not letting their children play with him because they were afraid radiation was contagious. Natasha is 43 years old. She lives in Germany. She is a doctor, ironically, specializing in oncology, treating cancer patients, dealing every day with the disease that has haunted our family for decades. She calls me more often than Dmitry does, maybe once a month, but the conversations are brief, surface level, careful. She does not ask about Chernobyl, and I do not volunteer information. In 1998, I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. They removed my thyroid. I have been on medication ever since. In 2004, I was diagnosed with leukemia. I underwent chemotherapy. It worked, for a while. The cancer went into remission. In 2011, the leukemia returned. More chemotherapy. More remission. In 2018, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. I have never smoked a cigarette in my life. The cancer was caused by inhaling radioactive particles in April of 1986. They removed part of my lung. I can no longer walk more than a few blocks without stopping to catch my breath. In 2023, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer, currently in treatment. The doctors tell me I am responding well. The doctors are lying. I know I am dying. I can feel it. I have been dying for 40 years. It is just taking a long time. Of the 600 operators, engineers, and staff who were working at the Chernobyl plant on the night of April 26, 1986, approximately 134 received acute radiation doses high enough to cause radiation sickness. Of those 134, 31 died within 3 months. Another 19 died within the following 2 years. Of the survivors, like me, almost all have developed radiation-related illnesses, cancers, heart disease, lung disease, immune disorders. We are dying, slowly but inevitably. Our bodies breaking down piece by piece. Payment for the sins of a system that valued production over people, secrecy over safety, ideology over truth. The firefighters who fought the blaze on the roof, the ones who received the highest doses, almost all died within weeks. 28 men, 28 fathers, husbands, sons, brothers. Heroes who saved countless lives by preventing the fire from spreading to the other reactors,
who did their jobs without hesitation, without being told the truth about what they were facing. The liquidators, the 600,000 men who were sent to Chernobyl over the following years to clean up the mess, to shovel radioactive debris, to build the sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor, to decontaminate buildings and vehicles and soil, received varying doses depending on their assignments and how long they stayed. Official Soviet statistics claim that only 31 people died from Chernobyl. 31. That number is a lie. That number only includes the acute deaths in the first 3 months. It does not include the firefighters who died in the first 2 weeks.
It does not include the liquidators who died from radiation-induced cancers in the years and decades afterward. It does not include the children born with birth defects, the increased cancer rates in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia, the thyroid cancers, the leukemias, the genetic damage that will affect generations. Independent estimates put the death toll between 4,000 and 93,000 people. 93,000. We will never know the real number because the Soviet government destroyed records, because Russia refuses to release classified documents, because tracking long-term radiation effects across multiple countries and decades is almost impossible. But I know this. I know that every single one of my friends who were in that control room with me on April 26, 1986, is dead, except for Boris Stolyachuk and myself. I know that most of the firefighters from that night are dead. I know that thousands of liquidators are dead. I know that children in Belarus are still being born with thyroid cancer rates 10 times higher than normal. I know that Pripyat is still abandoned, still contaminated, still a ghost city frozen in time. I know that the new sarcophagus they built over the reactor in 2016, the new safe confinement structure that cost $2.2 billion and is supposed to contain the radiation for 100 years, is a testament to the fact that we still, 40 years later, have not figured out how to clean up the mess we made. So why am I telling you this now? Why am I, a 70-year-old dying man, sitting in front of a camera and recording this story? Because silence is what they wanted. Silence is what they got for years. We were told not to speak. We signed documents. We were threatened. Some of us were imprisoned for talking. The Soviet government's first instinct was not to save lives. It was to control the narrative, to minimize the disaster, to protect the reputation of Soviet nuclear power, to avoid embarrassment on the international stage. They succeeded, partially. For 5 years, the full truth about Chernobyl was hidden. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, even after the archives were opened, the full story has never been told, because many of us who lived through it are too traumatized to speak, too afraid of reliving those memories, too broken to find the words. But I am dying anyway. The cancer is going to kill me within a year, maybe 2 if I am unlucky. I have nothing left to lose, no career to protect, no reputation to maintain, no government to fear. So I am telling you the truth, the whole truth, not for sympathy, not for attention, but because the world needs to understand what really happens when a nuclear reactor explodes, when governments lie, when workers are treated as expendable, when safety is sacrificed for production, when the truth is buried under layers of bureaucracy and propaganda and willful ignorance. You Americans, you live in a country where you can criticize your government without being arrested. You can speak truth to power without being imprisoned. You can demand transparency without being labeled an enemy of the state. You have freedoms that I never had, that my children never had growing up in the Soviet Union. Use those freedoms. Demand accountability. Question authority. Do not accept official narratives without evidence. Do not assume your government is always telling you the truth. Do not trust that corporations prioritize safety over profit. Do not believe that accidents cannot happen in your country, in your state, in your city. 3 Mile Island happened in Pennsylvania in 1979. Fukushima happened in Japan in 2011. Nuclear accidents do not only happen in the Soviet Union. They happen when safety cultures fail, when warning signs are ignored, when economic pressures override engineering judgment, when regulators are too cozy with the industry they are supposed to regulate. I am not anti-nuclear power. Let me be clear about that. Nuclear power, when done correctly, with proper design, proper training, proper regulation, proper oversight, is one of the safest forms of energy we have. The RBMK reactor design was flawed. It had a positive void coefficient that made it unstable at low power. It did not have a proper containment structure. These were known design flaws, documented in internal reports, but never fixed because fixing them would have been expensive and would have required admitting the design was flawed in the first place. The test we were running on the night of April 26th was a safety test, ironically, designed to improve the reactor's safety systems. But the test was planned poorly, executed poorly, supervised by people who were arrogant and overconfident, and conducted on a reactor that was already operating outside its safe parameters. The operators, myself included, followed procedures that we were taught. We followed orders from our supervisors. We trusted the people who designed the reactor when they told us it was safe. We were wrong to trust them. But we were also victims. We were not villains. We were working-class men trying to provide for our families, trying to do our jobs, trying to build a better future. We paid for the mistakes of others with our lives, with our health, with our families, with everything. So here is what I want you to take away from this story. Here is the lesson, if there is a lesson. Technology is not inherently safe or dangerous. It is only as safe as the systems that govern it, the people who operate it, the culture that surrounds it. Chernobyl did not happen because nuclear power is dangerous. Chernobyl happened because the Soviet system was broken, because corners were cut, because safety concerns were dismissed, because workers were not empowered to question their superiors, because the culture prioritized production and propaganda over truth and safety. Do not let that happen in your country. Do not let cost-cutting compromise safety. Do not let political pressure override engineering judgment. Do not let corporate profits take precedence over worker safety. Do not let government secrecy prevent public accountability. Speak up when you see something wrong. Question authority when authority is wrong. Demand transparency. Demand accountability. Demand that the people in power tell you the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when the truth is expensive, even when the truth makes them look bad. Because lies kill people. The lie that the reactor was intact killed firefighters who were sent to fight a fire they could not put out. The lie that radiation levels were only 3.6 Röntgen killed operators who were sent into areas that were lethally contaminated. The lie that Pripyat was safe for 36 hours after the explosion exposed 50,000 people to unnecessary radiation. Lies kill. Truth saves lives. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Seriously, many people give up halfway through stories like this, but you stayed. Now I want to ask you to do something. Like this video, subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed, and most importantly, comment. Comment what impacted you most about this story. Was it learning that my friends died in 14 days? Was it discovering the lies about the real numbers? Was it understanding that this could happen again, anywhere? Write down there what stuck with you, because these memories cannot die with me. I need to know that someone will remember. I need to know that when I am gone, when the last of us survivors are gone, people will still know what happened. People will still know the names. Alexander Akimov, Leonid Toptanov, Viktor Proskoryakov, Valery Perevoschenko, Vladimir Pravik, Viktor Kibanok. These are not statistics. These were men. Real men with families and dreams and futures that were stolen from them. Remember their names. Tell their stories. Do not let Chernobyl be forgotten. Do not let it become just another history lesson, sanitized and simplified and stripped of its human cost. I am 70 years old. I have lived 40 years longer than I should have. 40 years of pain, yes, but also 40 years of sunrises and sunsets, 40 years of watching the seasons change, 40 years of knowing that I survived when so many others did not. I do not know why I survived. I do not know why I was spared when better men died. But I know this. I survived to tell this story. I survived to bear witness. I survived to make sure the world knows the truth. And now I have told you. Now you know. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.